This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 655 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Last week on the show, I looked at ways to spot middle round running back breakouts. I've got ways to find late round breakouts too, but that's in the Late Round Draft Guide, which is currently available for purchase over on lateround.com. If you haven't listened to that episode, but you somehow found yourself listening to this one, hit pause, go back in the feed, and listen to that. I think it's the better show to listen to first. But today we're going to run through that same exercise, but with wide receivers. What should you be looking for in the middle rounds at the wide receiver position? What trends can help you increase your probability of hitting on the position in fantasy football? Those are the questions I'm going to help answer today. Before doing so, I wanted to give a shout to the Establish the Run podcast. The podcast is free and it's hosted by two legends in the fantasy space, Adam Levitan and Evan Silva. You probably remember them from their time at RotoWorld. Establish the Run episodes are quick, fun, and packed with analysis. They cover fantasy news and reactions, rankings, how to bet player props, best ball, and more. I think it's a great compliment to this podcast because it's more conversational in nature and they cover topics that I might not cover. I'm a longtime listener, and I can vouch that they know what they're talking about. So go check out the Establish the Run podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to sign up for FanDuel Fantasy. For users who have yet to make a deposit on FanDuel Fantasy, you can deposit today to receive 2 free entries. All you have to do is deposit a minimum of $10 in your FanDuel DFS account, and you'll be instantly rewarded with 2 free vouchers. Be sure to deposit now and play for free. Head over to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel Fantasy app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. Just like the running back episode, we have to figure out what it means to be a breakout from the middle rounds. We need some parameters. So, just like the running backs, I laid out a scatter plot where I plotted every player who's been drafted in fantasy football since 2011, and I compared that ADP to how many points per game that player ended up scoring. So on the x-axis of this graph, you've got average draft position. On the y-axis, you have how many points per game a player scored at that ADP. Once you plot all players since 2011, and this is thanks to myfantasyleague.com's ADP data, you can create a trend line. And what the trend line tells us is expectation. It tells us how many points we'd expect a player to score at a certain ADP based on history. In the Late Round Draft Guide, I looked at middle round wide receivers as players who were drafted between pick 60 and 108 in 12-team leagues. So round 6 through round 9. Since 2011, we've seen 167 wide receivers drafted between round 6 through round 9 in 12-team leagues while playing 8 games in a season. That's a pretty decent sample size. It's 167 wide receivers. Now the question is, how many of those players were breakouts? But what exactly does a breakout mean? I've defined breakouts in 2 ways, and this is going to sound very familiar if you've been listening to the show. But moderate breakouts are players who exceeded ADP points per game expectation by 3 or more PPR points. So for example, let's say a wide receiver who gets drafted 50th overall is expected to score 12 points per game in PPR formats, but he ends up scoring 15.5 points per game. That means he exceeded expectation by 3 or more points. He exceeded it by 3.5 points. That makes him a moderate breakout. A true breakout is a player who exceeds ADP expectation by 6 or more points. So if that same player had scored 18.5 PPR points per game, he would have been a true breakout. And for the record, those are just random numbers for example purposes. So of those 167 middle round wide receivers that we've seen drafted since 2011, 41 of them have been moderate breakouts. They exceeded ADP expectation by 3 or more points, accounting for 24.6% of our middle round sample. The true breakouts represented 7.2% of the sample. 12 wide receivers exceeded ADP expectation in the middle rounds during this time frame by 6 or more points. Those subsets, those groups, those are the guys that I analyzed to see if there are breakout wide receiver trends. And there are. I wouldn't be doing this show if there weren't. There are 3 things I want to call out on today's show that can help guide you in finding a breakout wide receiver in rounds 6 through 9. The first is similar to the running back episode last week, and you may have listened to the episode last month on this. But breakout wide receivers in the middle rounds, they tend to come from ambiguous wide receiver groups. but it's not as extreme as it is at running back. Let me explain. At running back, we found that we never see breakout middle round running backs when their teammates get drafted in rounds 1 and 2, their teammate running backs. At wide receiver, it was a deal, but it's not as big of a deal. During this time frame since 2011, we've had 24 middle round wide receivers who had a wide receiver teammate drafted in the first 2 rounds. 5 of those 24 wide receivers were moderate breakouts. That's not a great rate, but it's at least not 0 like it was with running back. But I do need to stress that middle round wide receivers generally break out at a lower rate when they have teammates getting drafted in the early rounds. Since 2011, 16.7% of middle round wide receivers with a teammate drafted in either round 1, round 2, or round 3, they ended up exceeding expectation by 3 or more points. So about 17% of these middle round wide receivers with early round teammates were moderate breakouts. Among the rest of the middle round sample, that number was 27%, so 10 percentage points higher. And the math is the exact same for true breakouts too. Just 2.4% of middle round wide receivers with a teammate selected in the first 3 rounds ended up as a true breakout. That was 8.8% among players who didn't have that kind of teammate. Now, I talked about this on the ambiguous wide receiver core episode back in June, but this makes a ton of sense. Wide receivers playing with elite wide receivers will likely have a tougher time really reaching a ceiling. But it's not the end all. Unlike running back, multiple wide receivers are on the field at once all the time. So multiple players can eat. It's just that it's still hard for that wide receiver 2 on his team to overcome his stud teammate. Some examples of this in 2022 include Devontae Smith with A.J. Brown going early, Adam Thielen with Justin Jefferson, and Hunter Renfrow with Devontae Adams. It's not the end of the world for them, and this is not best ball advice for the record. This is managed season-long leagues, although there's obviously some overlap. But historically, players in their positions have had a slightly lower hit rate than players in more ambiguous situations. Now, most of you who have been around all offseason already knew some of that, because I covered it on episode 645. But the second thing to keep in mind with these middle round breakouts is that team situation doesn't seem like that big of a deal. The average quarterback ADP for middle round breakouts since 2011 has been a little over 115, meaning these breakout wide receivers, their quarterbacks have fallen off fantasy draft boards on average at pick 115. For non-breakouts, that number is actually lower. It's 109, meaning their quarterbacks have been better. Now, I did split up team wide receiver 1s and team wide receiver 2s or worse within this data. This actually wasn't published in the late round draft guide, and I wish I would have thought to put it in, but team wide receiver 2s or worse who ended up being moderate breakouts, they had a quarterback ADP of 98.4, or their quarterback's ADP was on average 98.4. So you've got a middle round wide receiver who's not the first wide receiver being selected from his team. He ends up breaking out. Taking all of those players, their quarterback's ADP average was about 98, which makes sense that it was better than the wide receiver 1s in the middle rounds, because wide receiver 2s or worse are likely not going to be the first read for a quarterback. And better quarterbacks are going to get their number 2 or number 3 options involved more. And better quarterbacks generally have higher ADPs. The thing is, though, wide receiver 2s or worse who didn't break out, their quarterbacks still had better ADPs than that. So the quarterback ADP stuff is completely irrelevant. This doesn't mean that we should conclude that quarterback play itself is irrelevant at wide receiver in fantasy football. It just means that it's likely already baked into a player's cost. It may even be baked in too much given some of this data. Think about what breaking out means. A player is exceeding some expectation by a large number of points per game. In order to do that, he's doing something that people didn't expect him to do. So at the end of the season, maybe his offense was awesome. Maybe that helped him break out. And there is some validity to that, because breakout wide receivers do come from offenses that end up scoring about 0.2 more touchdowns per game than the offenses where non-breakouts came from. But it's likely that going into a season, we had no idea that offense would be as good as it ended up being, which is why we see quarterback ADPs look the way they do for these middle round wide receivers. And yeah, this isn't some flawless way of measuring this, especially because people are valuing quarterback rushing a little bit more than they did before, and those quarterbacks aren't necessarily better options for their pass catchers. Like in the end, you should strive to have a player in a good situation. You should want a player in a Josh Allen offense more than a Justin Fields offense. That's if we completely remove cost. But we have to keep two things in mind. Number one, generally speaking, the market is going to account for that. There is a cost involved. It's why Gabriel Davis has the ADP that he has right now versus Darnell Mooney, when Darnell Mooney is a much more proven player. But number two, wide receiver talent matters. A player won't see a high target share in his offense if he himself is not good, no matter the offense that he's in. Tight ends also don't seem to affect breakouts across a larger sample. I think that's probably because so few tight ends see obscenely high target shares to begin with, and of the tight ends who get drafted early, who do see those target shares, they don't always have middle round wide receivers for a study like this. So again, don't look at this in a black and white way. Just know that you don't need to bump a wide receiver down dramatically if he has one of those tight ends. Overall, I think it's easy to boost a player up during a draft because of his situation. But the reason I say situation doesn't matter much is because it seems like the market is already accounting for it. So you don't want to double count it. The key, and this is really key to all things fantasy football in a way, but the key is finding a breakout offense, an offense that has cost-effective players throughout your draft. If, for example, the Giants do really well this year with this coaching change, then all of their players are going to have an easier time beating ADP because ADP is reflecting a not so good offense. And then the last thing for these middle round breakouts is probably the most important. Similar to running back, age matters at wide receiver. Again, I'm doing all of this analysis by comparing players to where they were drafted or how people thought about those players entering a season, which is important because it gives us trends on how fantasy managers might be thinking about certain types of wide receivers. Now, I did an entire episode on rookie wide receivers in redraft leagues back on episode 647, and I noted how rookie wide receivers are really good bets in redraft leagues because not only do they exceed expectation at a pretty good rate, but they perform better during the second half of the season, which makes them even more attractive. When talking about the middle rounds in rookie wide receivers, we're really just talking about the best of the best. This year, we're talking about someone like Drake London. Historically, rookie wide receivers in the middle rounds have given you above average breakout rates, both in terms of moderate and true breakouts. In fact, rookie wide receivers have one of the highest breakout rates among any age group in the middle rounds. But you know who's been more impressive? You know who's been the most impressive? Second-year wide receivers. Second-year wide receivers in the middle rounds are freaking awesome. Almost 41% of them since 2011 have been moderate breakouts, with 11% of them being true breakouts. So they're really, really good bets to at least exceed expectation by a good number of points. And then they're decent bets compared to their counterparts at being league winners. Meanwhile, the general thought in fantasy circles is that third-year wide receivers are the ones you should target. They're the breakout candidates. But when compared to how the market acts, compared to expectation, that hasn't been the case over the last decade at all. In fact, of all the age groups at wide receiver since 2011, like literally every single age group, third-year wide receivers have had the worst breakout rate. And my explanation for that is that people probably think that the third-year breakout thing is a thing when it really isn't. So they inflate the cost for those players. Don't fall victim to that. A third-year player can be a fine pick, but they've been moderate breakouts at just a 9.5% rate since 2011. Remember, for second-year guys, that number was 40%. It was over 40%. And I talk about this in the draft guide, but fifth and sixth year wide receivers have done pretty well in the middle rounds as well. I think that's likely due to those players potentially switching teams after a rookie deal, or there just being some sort of survivor bias. As in players being drafted in the middle rounds who are in year 5 or year 6, they're likely good players. They have this high ADP or relatively high ADP despite being in the league so long. You know, they're veterans, but they're not past their age apex yet. So there's still room for a breakout. So don't ignore those players either. But overall, in these middle rounds, first and second year players are very good bets. Fifth and sixth year guys shouldn't be ignored either. And third year wide receivers are generally overrated. And of course, we don't see many breakouts after year 6, which isn't all that surprising. So wrapping this all up, you want ambiguous wide receiver situations. You want team wide receiver ones over team wide receiver 2s. You shouldn't care a ton about situation. And first and second year wide receivers, they tend to crush. That leaves us with players like Drake London, obviously, and then a lot of second year guys. Rashad Bateman, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Elijah Moore, Kadarius Toney, and sort of kind of Devontae Smith, even though he's got A.J. Brown going early. It's a really good year for these second year wide receivers. Maybe that means the market is catching up and realizing that these types of players are good, and that could lead to some of these trends not being as strong this year. But I do think buying into those guys is a good call, because historically, those are the types of players who have broken out. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Remember to check out lateround.com to purchase the Late Round Draft Guide. You can get more detail on all of this breakout talk and tons more. It's updated weekly through August, and it's just $24.99. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week.